Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Why Do We Do That? I am your host, Ryan Moyer. Now, since this is our very first broadcast, I thought that it would be very important to answer two very broad questions. The first being, who am I? And the second being, who is this podcast for? So I am a social psychologist by training. Social psychology is essentially the study of how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by social situations. So I earned my PhD from Florida Atlantic University in South Florida. My dissertation looked at the relationship between self-esteem and magical thinking and superstitious behavior. But in general, I'm very familiar with any sort of research area related to social cognition or decision making. Currently, I am an instructor at a local university teaching a psychology course. So who is this for? This is a psychology podcast, but it is for anyone that is in general just curious about human behavior. So do you like having conversations with your friends about why people do what they do? Then this podcast is for you. Do you like reading articles about human behavior? Do you like understanding trends, looking at trends in culture from a psychological perspective? If any of those descriptions sound like you, then this is going to be a podcast that you will enjoy. So it will essentially be formatted as a dialogue between myself and a variety of individuals, hopefully experts in their field. So specifically, I'll be focusing on having conversations with social scientists, clinicians, or clinical psychologists, and also anyone that uses applied psychology in their job. That's the ultimate goal. Have an interesting conversation about a topic that these people are passionate about. And that's essentially, the reason I started this podcast in the first place is because I had such a good time in grad school, drinking beers with my classmates and just having an interesting conversation about human behavior. It might be related to current events or our research. It could be just about anything, but they were very rich and meaningful conversations. And since podcasts have exploded in the past 10 years, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to capture some conversations between myself and other individuals that are experts in human behavior. My guest for the first episode of this podcast is Dr. Todd Shackelford. Todd is an evolutionary psychologist, and he's also the distinguished professor and chair of psychology at Oakland University. His research focuses currently on men's physical, emotional, and sexual violence against their partners. He's also the founder of the journal Evolutionary Psychological Science. We had a long conversation about sort of the broad aspects of evolutionary psychology. I'm personally a big fan of the area of evolutionary psychology because it goes beyond some of the biological explanations for human behavior. So if you think about, everyone can kind of easily get on board with the idea that there are biological influences on human behavior, genetics, hormones, all that kind of stuff, how our brain is wired. We all understand that, but evolutionary psychology attempts to go one step beyond that and answer the question of why. Why is it that our brains are wired a certain way? Why is it that we have certain preferences for mates? And I always found that interesting because evolutionary psychology looks to the past. It looks at the idea that specific evolutionary challenges may have been solved through natural selection and the idea that that certain behavioral tendencies and patterns of behavior would make an organism more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so I'm very interested in that, and we had a good conversation. We talked about a lot about mate preferences in terms of personality as well as physical mate preferences. We talked about jealousy and infidelity, which Todd has done a lot of research in that area as well. And I really hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here's Todd Shackelford. All right, so we're here with Todd Shackelford. Todd, so you've been an evolutionary psychologist for over 20 years now. Could you just start by giving us an overview of the principles that underlie evolutionary psychology?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having me on, Ryan. I appreciate it. So basically, evolutionary psychology, I see it as a perspective rather than sort of an area within psychology. Essentially, evolutionary psychology is the application of Darwin's principles of natural and sexual selection to the study of the mind. That is, to the study of the way the mind works, how it's apparently designed. We say apparently designed because there's no designer. How it appears to be designed, and what it appears to be designed to do. So while there is, of course, this subfield called evolutionary psychology, in principle, or maybe in practice, if enough time passes, there won't be any more evolutionary psychology because all psychology will be evolutionary psychology. Evolution by natural selection is the only scientific cause that we know of capable of producing complex apparent design. There are no creationist psychologists that I'm not legitimate psychologists. And so you don't really have an alternative but to take an evolutionary perspective. There really isn't, a defensible, respectable alternative.
Right. And so I always found it interesting, the analogy to the human body, in the sense that we have individual organs responsible for very specific tasks that all function, make our body function. And the brain, so is it the idea that the brain is set up the same way, both anatomically and with the just how it functions?
It is in many ways, and many evolutionary psychologists and others have made just that kind of argument. Actually, it's not unique to evolutionary psychologists. It's an argument that many cognitive psychologists make to sort of describe the structure of the mind. And that's exactly, as you've just suggested, the idea is that, if you open up the human body, you won't find one giant organ that does everything, that pushes blood throughout the body and detoxifies the body. You have separate specialized adaptations or organs, each one of which is designed to solve a particular problem. And there's really no reason to think that the mind will be any different. That is, that the information processing mechanisms of the mind will be any different. Another term for information processing mechanism is a mental organ. So rather than a physiological organ, a mental organ. But you asked the question about whether we might expect the brain itself to be physiologically built in these modules. And I don't think there's any reason to expect necessarily that they are. Many people I think it's a confusion. In other words, there's no reason to expect necessarily that the physiology of the brain will reflect the information processing functioning of the mechanisms of the mind. Occasionally, there is evidence for domain specificity of, brain areas. But for example, let me just give you an example. There's incredibly good evidence that jealousy, let's say sexual jealousy, is very much a domain-specific sort of mechanism of the mind. It's cued, it's triggered by very specific sorts of inputs, and it's a very predictable pattern of information processing. However, in large part, neuropsychologists who have investigated, using MRI technology, where in the mind, where in the brain are these sexual jealousy mechanisms. What they find is it's all over the brain. I mean, it's not just in one area. There isn't a single area of the brain that is dedicated to, processing information relevant to sexual jealousy or a partner's infidelity. So, I mean, having said that, I'm well aware that there are some areas of the brain that do appear to be relatively specialized, like the very specific area of the brain that sort of lights up, when people are detecting faces, for example, or recognizing, known faces. All of which is to say, we don't expect a one-to-one relationship between the domain specificity of the mind and the domain specificity of the brain.
Okay. It seems on the surface that it would be a difficult task to explain current psychological phenomena, how we behave now, using an environment of our ancestors that were, hundreds and thousands and in many cases, millions of years ago. How do you start to answer a question using evolutionary psychology when you know that the environment that built these mechanisms is completely different from today?
That's a great question. And you have to be aware of this. You have to be sensitive to this. And I'll just go back to the example of sexual jealousy. So yes, of course, there are many features of the modern environment that are different from the likely ancestral environment, or the environment that we, have good reason to believe was characteristic of our ancestors. But there are also likely to be some parallels. So for example, there's no reason to believe that our ancestors, that is, all of our ancestors, our male and female ancestors, didn't also face relatively sex-specific adaptive problems when it comes to relatedness to offspring. So ancestral males almost certainly experienced what's referred to as paternal uncertainty. That is, could never be certain that the offspring their partners were producing were in fact their genetic offspring, whereas ancestral females, there's no reason to think that they weren't absolutely certain that the offspring they're pushing out is their own. And so the modern environment is such, yes, in many ways it's different, but there are some similarities. For example, it remains the case that paternal uncertainty, is an adaptive problem, or, it's just as relevant to understanding the way the mind works today as it was over much of our evolutionary history. Similarly with maternal certainty. But, there are occasions where you have to take into consideration, how the modern environment might affect those underlying psychological adaptations. Those, for example, that were built to solve problems of partners' infidelity. So, for example, we now have widespread access to birth control, and one might predict, well, maybe a man who's partnered to a woman who's on birth control, well, maybe that just nullifies the whole risk of paternity certainty problem, and maybe you would expect those men, therefore, to not express the same level of sexual jealousy. I mean, I would have predicted this data have been collected. The data have been collected, and the modern male mind isn't designed to process the uniquely contraceptive effect of modern birth control. And men act just the same way. I mean, they're just as sexually jealous, whether or not their partner's on a super effective birth control or not. The argument is that effective birth control, at least that effective, was not a feature of our evolutionary history, and therefore we're unlikely to have evolved, psychological adaptation that's sensitive to that kind of information. It appears to go in one ear and out the other, because men behave just the same whether or not their partner's taking birth control or not.
Interesting. Right. So
yeah.
So in many cases, I guess the all of these unique features of our world today can still be understood in an evolutionary context, because all of the changes that are occurring, basically they create kind of predictable hypotheses, right? Now, before I definitely want to spend a lot of time actually talking about mate preferences and,
Sure.
going into depth about jealousy and infidelity. But before that, I wanted to address the controversial nature of evolutionary psychology, because now, again, again, evolutionary psychology is a relatively new field compared to other branches of psychology, but
Sure.
probably just has the same amount of rigor involved. Yet it also receives a larger percentage of the criticism for some reason.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a couple common criticisms and how you would address them. So
Sure.
one of the big ones is culture, right? The influence of culture. So some people would argue that, well, if you're saying that there are these evolved mechanisms that are in all human beings, how do you explain cross-cultural differences? So what would you say to that?
Well, first I'll say that, there is, in fact, now, probably in the last 10 or 15 years, a very rich area of research that investigates exactly what we're talking about. And people often refer to themselves as cross-cultural evolutionary psychologists or evolutionary cross-cultural psychologists. And so there is there is a significant area of work that's investigating things like cross-cultural variation. And the principle that, the presumption is that we're all humans. Okay, we all have the same basic structure of mind, and we all have the same basic set of adaptations, assuming we're not talking about sex-specific adaptations. In which case, how do we understand cross-cultural variation? For example, and just to continue the thread, there's been a lot of work on cross-cultural variation in sexual jealousy. And some of this, I've done along with colleagues, and we find, for example, that we know in the United States there's a huge sex difference where men report being more upset by partners' sexual infidelity, women more upset by partners' emotional infidelity, and that's related to the sex-specific adaptive problems that men and women have currently faced. Okay, now what we've found, and now there's work on about, maybe 50 different cultures. It's not every culture in the world, but it's maybe 50 in every continent. And what we find is that the sex difference is there in every single culture. It does not reverse. In fact, it doesn't even nullify. There is no culture where men are more upset by emotional infidelity than are women, or women more upset by sexual infidelity than are men. On the other hand, there's very interesting cultural variation. So, for example, we find that the sex difference is smallest. It's still there, but it's smallest in Northern European countries, in Norway and Finland and Sweden. It's there, it's significant, but it's significantly smaller. Whereas it's huge, just gigantic in African countries and in South American countries. I don't have an explanation for that, but it needs to be explained. And that is where a lot of the work is trying to understand cross-cultural variation. And I think the most promising avenue, at least initially, is to ask what is different about the input that people are getting in these different cultural environments, rather than assume that people must be built differently in South America and in Africa than they are in Northern Europe. I think that is a much more likely to be false presumption. And so you want to ask, what are the kind of inputs that the universal adaptations are processing? And might that account for the differences in the output of those adaptations?
So if there was, is it possible that that if you were to observe something that was completely counterintuitive to an evolutionary psychology principle? So let's take attractiveness, for example. So evolutionary psychology proposes that there are sort of biological standards of attractiveness that we can measure. If there were a culture that completely defied that standard of attractiveness, the waist to hip ratio, so right? There's identified a waist to hip ratio that signals fitness for humans. Is that possible? If you were to observe that culture, what would that do to the data showing that there are biological factors that are associated with attractiveness?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you noted, at this point, actually the waist-hip ratio example, there is some variation now. It's not necessarily the case that 0.7 waist-hip ratio is the most preferred. There is some variation. So let's just take another example. Let's take an example, if it's okay. Let's take an example like men preferring youth and physical attractiveness more than do women in a prospective partner. And the question is that true in every culture? And the answer is, it is in every single culture. So now up to almost 100 different cultures, where in every one of these cultures, men report valuing physical attractiveness and youth more than do women. Women, on the other hand, report valuing resource acquisition and status striving more than do men. Okay, but let's imagine we find a culture. But you have to, so there's the backdrop. The backdrop is there's, 20 years worth of research, 30 years worth of research, and about, several dozen studies across 100 different cultures showing that men value physical attractiveness in youth more than do women. Now, the onus is going to be on the researcher who finds that among the Bongo or some other remote tribe, now suddenly it's men who value status acquisition and women value attractiveness in youth. My bias, and I don't think it's my bias, I think a rational person would say the weight of the evidence is such that the person who finds something dramatically different really we have to look into it, think about this. How could this have come about? I mean, let's imagine that it really is, and we replicate it, and by God, there it is. It's a reversed sex difference. Well, we have to think about what might be different in this particular environment. Is it something different in terms of, the parental environment and the local, social support? I mean, I have no idea. But you wouldn't automatically just say, well, I guess men don't value physical attractiveness in youth more than do women. But you would want to be humble, and I think the appropriate scholarly response would be, we need to know more about that. And I must say that every time someone claims that they found such a culture, it never holds up. It always turns out to have been they were either lied to by their participants or they fudged the data. I mean, but it could be. And what you wouldn't do is you wouldn't throw out the idea that the best way to understand psychology is by taking an evolutionary perspective. It wouldn't discount the utility of taking an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, I think about the sort of like the Danica Patrick scenario where it's like, well, men have a preference for NASCAR and they tend to, let's just say preference. And then it's like, well, what about Danica Patrick? It's like, yes, that is an exception the exception that proves the rule. It just, the reason that the only famous NASCAR driver that is a female implies that there's some underlying preference. There's some underlying preference for males, right?
Yeah. That reminds me of a really good example. And I think that this touches on something that I think is, I think is also very interesting and I think is relatively newer within evolutionary psychology. And that's looking at, for example, with respect to mate preferences, we know for a fact that not every single man values physical attractiveness and youth more than does every single woman. In fact, we know that's not true. We know there are some women who value physical attractiveness and youth more than the average man, and vice versa with respect to men valuing status acquisition, for example. We know that there are some men who value status and resources in a partner more than does the average woman. There we're talking about within sex differences. I mean, both can be true. You could have average sex differences, which do exist, and yet, you've got, 1,000 men. Well, some of those men, they're not all going to answer exactly the same. And I think that's a very interesting question, is how to understand within sex variation. Why is it that some men, for example, just to bring it back again to sexual jealousy, some men do report that emotional infidelity is more upsetting than is sexual infidelity. who are these men? And I think the answer there, I think the most productive initial line of work is to ask, what is different about the way they're processing information or the information that's coming into their system, rather than to assume that, well, they must be a different species.
It gets me thinking about the extent to which we engage in sort of statistical thinking, where thinking about a group of human beings that vary but have trends. Like there are gender trends, and some of those might be completely, men and women might be completely different, versus others that are far more subtle. But if you look on average, you might see a slight bump for males versus females, or vice versa.
Right.
And I think that probably plays a role into some of these discussions. So we've touched on mate preferences. So let's dive in. Now, obviously, we're talking about both physical preferences and personality preferences for males and females. We talked about waist to hip ratio. We know that there's some variation, but generally there are some biological indicators of attractiveness. What are some of the tried and true biological indicators of fitness that we tend to see in the population?
So, do you mean of physical attractiveness? Like somebody would say, "Oh, that person's beautiful," or?
Well, let's say physical attraction, because obviously there are, right? So the idea here is that we're talking about something observable, right? So the idea is that if I'm out there searching for a mate, I'm physically making evaluations in terms of what I find attractive. What are some of the things that I might be looking for?
Sure. So, and there are some, well-established, culturally ubiquitous sort of standards or traits. So we know in women, so in terms of women's attractiveness, we know that youth, as reflected in, fewer wrinkles, for example, in larger lips, more plump lips. These are all clearly linked. These are linked, like plump lips are linked to estrogen levels and therefore to youth. But also relatively narrow jaw for women and a relatively small chin. These are also linked to sex steroids, namely testosterone. These are features of faces that are ubiquitously reported to be attractive. And we know this because there's a whole history of work on ratings of attractiveness. And that's asked Japanese people to assess attractiveness among, sub-Saharan African people. They show them just a series of faces, and every group pretty much agrees. I mean, agreement at the level of 95%. There's an incredible amount of agreement across cultures, across races. I mean, and what we can ferret out is that in women, it's various traits associated with youth, with smooth skin, with large plump lips. In men, attractiveness, physical attractiveness is typically key to, this is true for women also, for high cheekbones, relatively high cheekbones. For men, it's a broad jaw, a relatively longer chin, relatively smaller eyes. In women, it's relatively larger eyes. So these are all sort of typical. In other words, there aren't cultures in which, and also symmetry is a very good predictor of ratings of attractiveness. So relative symmetry of the face.
Now,
go ahead.
What I've been really impressed with and fascinated with is the evolution of the methodology for studying these topics, right? So 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, the only way that we could objectively study attractiveness was by showing photos of individuals, maybe even bringing them in person.
Right.
But now, more advanced methods, we can take a face and alter characteristics of that face in a digital environment, show it to people, and ask them, which version they find more attractive.
Right.
the best part about that is that it actually is it's a better way to measure these principles and test these hypotheses. Has this added has this additional technology to study these questions made the case stronger for what we've seen?
Definitely. I mean, aside from, I want to put to one side a lot of the research on ovulatory cycle effects and the extent to which a woman's place in her ovulatory cycle affects her attractiveness or affects her ratings, because that work is getting, I think it's less clear. I mean, there's new research suggesting that the findings aren't quite as clear as was once thought. On the other hand, all of the work looking at things like assessments of facial physical attractiveness, of things like width of the jaw, length of the chin, the symmetry of the face, have been all of that work has been very well replicated using much more fine-tuned methodological techniques. And I think it's what it does, and you can show that attractiveness goes up, with tiny increments, that nobody even knows consciously that the face looks any different, but because you've adjusted the computer image, you've adjusted the extent to which testosterone has been enhanced or decreased, and so there are a lot of people who have built careers on just this kind of research, which is super. It relies, not in a bad way, but it relies appropriately on technology that was only dreamed of 30 years ago.
Right. Now, you previously mentioned that men tend to focus on physical attractiveness and youth more than women. Let's move on past the physical attributes a little bit and talk about personality. So, I would be willing to say that if you ask the average woman on the street, what are you looking for in a male? You might hear sense of humor. You might hear has a job. Like those are two of the big things. Obviously,
Sure.
There's something underlying those that might that it's a little bit more complex. It's not just about the job. It's not just about sense of humor. But is that accurate? Is that something that would be supported with the literature?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that most of that literature, just to be clear, actually differentiates whether we're talking about, would you want to have sex with that person, or would you want to potentially get involved in a relationship with that person? And that really is two different questions. I mean, there is overlap, of course, in some of the characteristics desired in a prospective partner, but there are some interesting differences as well. So, for example, so we can talk about women's long-term mate preferences. Absolutely. Actually, the top three for both men and women across cultures for long-term partners are good sense of humor, kindness, and something like dependability or emotional stability. In other words, this is based on work where you're asking someone, okay, what are you looking for in a marriage partner? Okay, well, yeah, it's nice if they're attractive, but that's, that may or may not be the most important. In fact, we know it's not the most important thing. The most important thing are things like, I think it's intelligence. It's kindness, intelligence, and good sense of humor, or something like that. It's not, men don't say physical attractiveness is the number one thing on average. What's interesting is that for men, out of 18 characteristics, for men, physical attractiveness is like number 4 or 5. For women, it's like number 9 or 10. Note that it's not at the bottom. I mean, women also would prefer to be with someone who's, pretty to look at. After all, you're going to be with them, than someone who's not, or someone who, looks unhealthy. That's also, that scores very highly across cultures for both men and women. Good health. So, in terms of personality, but I mentioned dependability, emotional stability. I mean, that's...
So you said that it is important to distinguish between whether or not you want to have intercourse with a person versus settle down with that person.
Right.
Now, those motives, I assume they kind of ebb and flow over time. So what do we know about are there situational factors I assume age is a big part of it. What are the factors that will push people to one motivation or the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's been some work on this. We know that, I'm just thinking about women for one moment. So the extent to which they're pursuing or interested in a long-term relationship versus a short-term relationship. We know that young women are, again, self-reportedly, and there's some triangulated sort of research that suggests that they're not just lying. I mean, younger women are more likely to report being involved in short-term relationships than are older women, except older women who have recently divorced. Older women who have recently divorced often report, engaging in short-term sexual relationships. Now, the question is, are they engaging in those relationships by design, or do they have some, or was this a short-term relationship that was, they were hoping, might, blossom into a long-term relationship? And there's some work looking at some of those questions. One thing I did want to mention before I forgot is there's very interesting time difference. So preferred time difference. So for women who are interested in a long-term partner, I mentioned that, physical attractiveness is not irrelevant. I mean, it's like, towards the bottom half or so. It's still important. But physical attractiveness becomes incredibly important if we're talking about a short-term sexual partner. Then women will report that the most important thing is that he's pretty. He's pretty to look at. One possible explanation is that, what are women getting out of a short-term sexual relationship? Well, ancestrally, one of the things they're getting are potentially good genes, high-quality genes. There's work on the benefits that women reap by virtue of short-term mating. But a lot of this work suggests that, again, even if modern women are taking birth control, ancestrally, short-term mating by design, from a female's perspective, may well be, the solution to the adaptive problem of how do I get good genes for my offspring. And we know that guys who are more physically attractive, they're more sexually attractive. They have more sex, they're propositioned for more sex. They're more likely to be unfaithful to their partners. And so they have something that women desire in these short-term contexts.
Now, I wonder if there's, is it possible that one of the motives for a woman engaging in a short-term sexual relationship, are there social, is there a social benefit for that, like a signaling, or because one of the things that I find fascinating about this research is that everything gets complicated when you have two individuals trying to build a relationship. So like it sounds like it could be signaling to other women that I am capable of getting attractive males. It could be something like it simply boosts my self-confidence, and that has some sort of impact on my future ability to obtain attractive mates. I know enough males. I've had enough conversation with other men about just the idea of it sounds crude, but conquering, sleeping or copulating or hooking up with someone that's more attractive than them gives them a huge boost of confidence.
Sure.
I don't know if that has played a role in any of the findings.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. In fact, typically, women do report that it makes them feel better about themselves if they can, basically, hook up with a guy who's super attractive, who other women agree is super attractive. Yeah, absolutely. The question is, I would see that as more of a proximal sort of benefit. The question is, why do women respond like that? Why are women insensitive to what other women think about, the attractiveness of the men with whom they have sex? And I think there's definitely, in a highly social species like humans, it matters. People talk about it. People talk about who's had sex with whom. And we have this new work, it just got accepted. It'll be out in JPSP on human status criteria across, it's about 20 different cultures. But basically what we look at is how different acts by men and women are viewed across different cultures. And there are, on average, if a woman's going to have sex on a short-term basis, she has, by other people's reports, she actually stands to gain in status if he's super attractive, and lose in status if he's not at all attractive. I mean, there are cultures, by the same token, that if a woman has short-term sex, she's perceived as, she loses a great amount of status. But what I'm getting at here is, it's very clear that status acquisition for women certainly can be tied to the attractiveness of the men with whom she has sex. So yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in bringing that up, and I agree. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So I did want to get your take on today's trends in terms of intimate relationships. So it seems as though, again, obviously there's some age effects. I'm 37. I can't really speak for those in their 20s, but it seems as though traditional masculinity in an intimate relationship has become less important over the last, let's say, 30 years. Whereas, in the past, it might have been, it just feels as though, being hardy, being stoic, working with your hands, kind of these stereotypical masculine traits have become less important, and now women have become more accepting of variability in men, and are being attracted to men that don't exhibit these traits. I see a lot of memes about nerds are sexy, right? This idea right. that a really intelligent individual that isn't necessarily physically strong or like that, that women are reporting that they're proud to be attracted to this type of male. Yeah. Do you have thoughts about that? Have you seen the same trend, or am I just making this up?
Well, no, I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, what we do find, though, I don't know that that's necessarily new. I mean, it may be that we're talking about it more, but, I mean, women, trade off, for example, physical attractiveness and masculinity in a long-term context. They'll trade that off. By their own reports, they'll trade that off. There's a lot of interesting work doing these like little economic games. You give them a certain number of tokens and they get to like partition out, to the different categories, the different preferences, how they would divvy it up. And if you're talking about a long-term relationship, women generally are reasonably forgiving of a wimpy guy, so long as he commands status and commands resources and has, is very intelligent, and he has a trajectory in front of him. But I don't know that that's necessarily any different.
So would that? Okay, so that's interesting. So it's not so much that they're less masculine. It's just a shift away from physical, traditional American masculine traits to a different type of status. Like maybe it's how status has changed and signaled. But do you think that would also be true for short-term sexual relationships? So it makes sense long-term for status in the 50s is going to work every day and fixing things around the house. Status now might be just, being a software engineer and bringing home enough resources and money to take care of the family. But do you think that would also be observed with the short-term sexual relationships?
No, it's not actually. I mean, women continue to value, by their own reports, physical attractiveness and sexiness. It can be asked in a variety of different ways. I mean, if you ask them, they will tell you that they're not at all forgiving of a guy who's wimpy and not attractive if they're talking about a short-term relationship. I mean, even if he's, they'll trade off. They're less likely to trade off physical attractiveness and sexiness and muscularity. And that doesn't seem to have changed much at all. I mean, we published a paper a few years ago where we looked at the changes in mate preferences over the past 60 years. We had data from like the 1930s all the way up to at that time, the late 1990s, early 2000s. And really not a lot changed despite all of the upheaval, in the culture and all the access to media and, mainstream, being inundated with all this. But there were a couple of changes. One is both sexes emphasized physical attractiveness more. Both sexes emphasized physical attractiveness more in the modern environment than in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And one explanation, I don't have the explanation, but one hypothesis is that that's what happens when you have mass media exposure to impossibly beautiful people. It might sort of tickle those psychological mechanisms and cause people to, misassess how prevalent attractive people are in their environment. So at any rate.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I do want to, so let's move on and talk a little bit about jealousy and intimate partner violence.
Sure.
Because I know you've done a lot of work in this area. What's the recipe for partner-directed violence? I assume there are a couple factors that might make this behavior more likely.
Yeah, I mean, if we're just talking, we know the predictors of intimate partner violence. Just talking about physical violence for a moment. It's much more likely to occur. First of all, it's much more likely to be men physically abusing their partners, and very often, men's abuse is preceded by their suspicions of their partner's infidelities. And whether those are actual or not, the fact is men perceive this risk. And so we know that, and this is across every culture for which we have data, that suspicions of a partner's infidelities are tragically predictive of men's physical violence against their partners. Men are more physically violent when they're mated to younger and more attractive women as well. But again, you want to look at, the particular sort of couple also. Mate value discrepancy, when one partner is has higher mate value or possible value as a partner on the mating market, that's a predictor of domestic violence. But one thing.
So the idea of, let's take a step back. So you can think of each person in a relationship as having a certain level of mate value, which is sort of basically a summary of physical attractiveness and resources and whatever fits into the attractiveness equation.
Right.
So the idea is that if there's a discrepancy, one partner is far more successful / attractive than the other, that could be the breeding grounds for friction.
Yes, it could be, right. And the work to date suggests that violence is more predictable where it's the woman who has much higher, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships, where it's the woman that has a much higher mate value than does the man.
So how does that explanation work, right? So, a naive person would say, well, from an evolutionary perspective, why is it that men would be capable of physically assaulting someone in an intimate relationship? Why would that? Doesn't make sense to me, right? Why would that even be an evolved behavior? What does the explanation look like for that type of behavior, and why we engage in it?
Yeah, sure. The explanation for men's violence against their partner turns on the presumption that it works. So men who beat their partners, who physically assault their partners, one possibility is that ancestrally, however much we abhor it morally, it worked. So women who are physically assaulted by their partners become fearful of being unfaithful or of leaving their partner. And I think that's part of the answer to why it takes women so many times to actually leave. They're afraid for their life.
And it also, in a sad way, it underscores the evolutionary imperative to reproduce in a relationship, right? So if you think from a male perspective, they want to pass on their genes onto the next generation. it's not terribly important that you have a good emotional relationship with that woman, as long as your genes are going to be able to make it into the next generation. Is that accurate?
I mean, but there are also costs to using physical violence. I mean, men do sometimes, they're violent to the point of killing their partners. And there's a lot of, sort of debate about whether that was a designed killing. Was that the intention, or was it, a consequence of the violence going a little bit too far? And I guess not to get into that here, but it reminded me as you were speaking that there's also very interesting work now. It's been replicated both in the United States and in Mexico, showing that women who live in a community in which they have adult male genetic relatives are less at risk of physical abuse by their partner than are women who don't have, adult male genetic relatives living in the vicinity. It's as if men married to these women are processing, well, I might not want to use this tactic because they may come after me. And men, of course, do come after abusive spouses. I'm
not going to take that kind of risk when I have my wife's large brothers living next door within 5 minutes. Yeah, that's interesting.
And that's what the data indicate. And again, all that this work was simply looking at correlations between number of adult male relatives and frequency of violence. And there's a strong negative relationship between these two variables. We don't know why. One hypothesis is that males process this kind of information. Maybe I shouldn't do this. I mean, I brought that up because there are also costs to using physical violence. It's if there weren't, then in principle, many more men would be using it.
So, for final thoughts, I always, if every time I'm talking to a researcher, I always like to ask at least one applied psychology question, which is that looking at all of these factors that are relating to domestic violence scenarios and stuff like that, whether it's verbal or whether it's psychological or physical, do you? I know it's an early area this is fairly new research, but do you see any potential application for developing a solution from this research? Right. I know that from purely theoretical research, oftentimes it might just be, well, we know that shouldn't work, right? The data shows that, well, that's not a great idea. But do you anticipate any potential ideas that could apply to public policy or to communicate to victims or potential victims of these types of behaviors?
Yeah, certainly. I think, one of the reasons that women don't leave abusive partners is because they have the sense that they have nowhere else to go. That was sort of the impetus for, the development of these shelters for victims of domestic violence. And it also accounts for why these shelters are almost always located in undisclosed locations. The reason is that men will go to incredible lengths to track these women down. And I think we know that these domestic violence shelters are far over capacity virtually all the time. They have very few resources. And this is just one possible solution, is to do a much better job in providing these kinds of support services for women who are victims of domestic violence. They need a place to go. They don't need just a place to go. They need, money for food. They need money for a ticket to get to a different city where their mom lives or something. And I think, some of that is going on, but, my reading of the literature is that, we have a long ways to go before most women see that as a potential solution. So that's just an initial thought. We know that
is this research? Is there anywhere we can go to find potential articles on this topic?
You mean specifically on the
your research
sure.
on the intimate partner violence?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, we've published a lot of work on this topic over the last 20 or so years, and you can find all of my papers and books and stuff like that at my lab website, which is just my name, basically. It's www.toddshackelford.com. And it's all, you can find it by the title. I mean, you can click on the article and download it right there. So that's all at my lab website. Well, at any rate, there's other many books on the topic, and people are welcome to contact me directly, and I'd be happy to correspond. And my email is also listed on my website.
Well, great. Thank you. It's been an enriching conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it as well.
That concludes episode 1 of Why Do We Do That? I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, head over to Facebook and type in Why Do We Do That? You can follow our Facebook page. Just click like or follow. You can also email me at whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Hopefully in the short term, I'll have a new episode for you every month for you to listen to. But until next time, I'm Ryan Moyer, hoping that you were able to get some answers to the question, why do we do that?